All right, everyone. I think we will go ahead and get started, even as we wait for a few more people to join the session. So first of all, a huge welcome to all of you. Thank you for being with us today. Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, depending on what time zone you're joining us from. My name is Peter Mandeville. I'm the interim director of the Ali Vural Center for Global Islamic Studies and professor of international affairs at the Schar School of Policy and Government, both of which are at George Mason University. This is the inaugural session in a new series of webinar sessions that we're going to be running over the course of the summer and the fall that explore the intersection of the COVID-19 pandemic and Muslim religiosity. We're trying to understand the various ways that the global pandemic has affected aspects of Muslim religious life with respect to questions of new theological and legal debates, new discussions and debates going on about religious authority, the various ways that the structural circumstances, including systems of structural exclusion and racism in Muslim communities, have had a differential impact on how those communities have experienced the pandemic. And of course, we'll also be looking at how some very particular Muslim groups and movements have been responding to events of the last few months. I am delighted that the series is being opened this afternoon by Dr. Adnan Zulfiqar of Rutgers Law School, who will be offering a presentation on mapping legal responses to COVID-19, the case of Islamic law. Dr. Zulfiqar is Associate Professor of Law at Rutgers Law School and is a legal historian whose scholarship focuses on the underlying assumptions and frameworks that drive legal discourse. His primary fields of inquiry are Islamic law and American criminal law and procedure. He's an editor for Harvard Law School's Sharia Source Project. He serves on the editorial board of the Arab Law Quarterly and is the outgoing chair of the section on Islamic law at the American Association of Law Schools. He holds a JD, MA, and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as degrees from Georgetown and Emory universities. A few brief procedural notes before we hand over to Dr. Zulfiqar. I want to first please ask that everyone make sure that their actual name is showing in the participant list, so that particularly, when it comes time to call on you to ask questions or enter the discussion, we can actually call on a person. You can use the rename function in the participant window as needed. At the end of Dr. Zulfiqar's remarks today, I will be moderating a question and answer session, and there's two ways that you can participate in this. You can either ask your question live, in which case we would ask you to use the raise hand feature, which you can see within the participant window, or you can use the question and answer dashboard, which is also a separate function in Zoom, and put your question in a written form. Given the format of our session today, I'd ask you to please be as concise and direct as possible with your question so that we can fit in as many as possible given the limited time we have together. And so without further ado, let me hand the virtual floor over to Dr. Zulfiqar. Welcome, Adnan, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here and to share some of my thoughts on this project that I've been engaged in. And I know that I want to have some time for Q&A, so I want to be mindful of the time and kind of get right into it. But before I do that, I do want to be sure to thank everyone at the Center for Global Islamic Studies, George Mason, Peter, Aisha Noor, Ahmed, etc., for just being very diligent in helping set this up and for inviting me to give this talk. Okay. All right. So I'm hoping that the screen is visible to everyone. Okay.
Yes, we can see it, Adnan.
Okay, wonderful. So this project is, how did this project come about? Just to give you a background of sort of where this is coming from. The project, it's a Mapping COVID-19 Fatwas project. It started off with really about the early part of March, where the sort of COVID-19 pandemic became much more of a, I guess, in some respects, part of global awareness, if you will, at least for us here in the United States, and I think certainly for other parts of the world as well. I began to notice an uptick in the amount of commentary that was happening from Muslim jurists or religious scholars with regard to Islamic law and sort of Islam in general, at least, and the pandemic and COVID-19 and this virus. And I started seeing that initially in sort of video format, where these Q&A sessions that take place on TV shows throughout the Muslim world, where these types of questions relating to the coronavirus were showing up. That got me curious. It got me curious because I wanted to see, okay, well, what are the types of legal arguments, the types of arguments generally around religion that are being made in this regard. And so that brought about this collaboration with Harvard Law School, their program in Islamic law, Sharia Source, which is a great resource that exists there. And we sort of collectively came up with a way in which to store my findings or what I was discovering over there. So that was kind of the first step with regard to this. The purpose of the project, among other things, is really to, one, capture the types of conversations that are taking place right now, the types of legal discourses that are taking place in the Muslim world and broader. So, and that's something that I'm going to get into with regard to scope. To get into that, to look at that and sort of see what's happening there. And part of that is my own interest as a scholar is one where I'm interested in looking at how revolutionary moments of kind of existential crisis can provide insights into juristic creativity, how dynamic law can be, and Islamic law in this case, how sort of dexterous it can be, its agility to adapt to these new types of situations. So that fascinates me and was one of the reasons why I did something similar around the Arab Spring and fatwas in 2011. So that's where this presented this new type of existential crisis to look at. The one big disclaimer I have that I have to put out here is these are, and what I'm sharing with you are my initial preliminary observations on this topic. I have not had the time to dig into every single fatwa with too much depth, but it's kind of my initial observations to as to what I'm finding and some of the interesting things that are there. And the other thing that I have to note, especially for those who may be joining the call and aren't necessarily scholars of Islam or sort of familiar with Islamic law that much, one of the sort of animating features of Islamic law, or arguably for me, the animating feature of Islamic law is the idea of obligation, the idea of duty and obligation. And so a lot of the discussion that takes place within the legal discourse, even here around COVID, is around what duties and what obligations people have in this particular context. Okay, so those are sort of my initial ideas, sort of disclaimers, etc. Now, the scope. So part of the scope is defining parameters, right? You've got to figure out, we had to figure out, well, what are we going to include? What are we not going to include? And some of these things were easy, to be honest. Which languages should be included? That was easy for us, all of them, as many as we could. I had certain languages that I had my own expertise in, and you can see that the sort of fatwa list so far, which is about 201, they are in Arabic, Urdu, Farsi, and English, the sort of 4 primary languages that I work with. But then you will also find Indonesian, you'll find Turkish, and there are a couple others that I've been able to collect through the help of other individuals. So languages was easy. Geographical coverage, also easy. We wanted to cover as much of the globe as we could. Initially, I started off with just thinking about the Muslim world, but we extended that to include England, some fatwas from South Africa, some from the United States, etc. The harder questions were ones which, are tough for any scholar. What counts as a fatwa? What doesn't count? What other types of speech can be included? Maybe it's not a fatwa as such, but there's some type of legal opinion or legal argument that's being made there. They're being made in articles that scholars write. They're being made in statements, bayans that scholars give. They're being made in khutbas, sermons that preachers are giving. So what is going to be included and what's not? And then who counts as a scholar, right? Whose voice matters with regard to Islamic law? And these are really sort of larger questions, especially the last one, that in some respects are even beyond the scope of this project and debated widely among people within the field. What we ended up deciding, or really I decided, was that we were going to include all types of fatwas, formal and informal. And by informal, I mean, occasions where they're occurring on video, or it's just a question and answer that's happening, which isn't sort of formally being written down as a fatwa. We were going to include statements that scholars were issuing, either on their website or elsewhere. And we were not going to, or made a decision to not include khutbas within this collection. And part of that is these sermons that happen, they're just so many. It's not always clear kind of the type of legal opinion that's being given there. Oftentimes it's a reference to some other opinion or someone else's opinion. So that was kind of left to the side. I'd included certain initially, and then I put them off to the side for a bit. Okay, that moves us then. So that's kind of the scope that we're looking at. All right. Now, the question became finding the fatwa. Where are we going to find these fatwas? The traditional format is to look for these fatwas that maybe are being issued by either scholars who routinely have some sort of function within their particular office. This is especially true in Iran, for instance, where scholars, their offices, their maktabs will have sort of formal fatwa issuing functions, or the Dar al-Iftas, the sort of government affiliated agencies within various Muslim countries whose job it is to actually issue fatwas. That is, they're doing it in much more traditional formats, oftentimes with sort of the same type of structure, or structure that is familiar from the standpoint of fatwas as we understand them historically. Okay, from that standpoint, then the other question comes up: modern formats. What do we do about that? How do we discover, or how do we sort of try to examine and find the modern formats of fatwa issuing? And this is something that I had come across in my research as it related to the Arab Spring, because what you were finding there was not necessarily fatwas being issued, sort of someone sitting in a room, putting their stamp of approval or their particular insignia on it, and then sending out this written piece of paper with their fatwa. You were also finding scholars who were out in the protests, and there were videos of them with megaphones, and they literally had someone with the megaphone who poses the question of that hypothetical interlocutor or the actual real interlocutor. And then the scholar on the megaphone issues his response or answer to that question. I wanted to be able to capture that as well, because in many respects, I think that the influence of many of these informal or modern formats of issuing fatwas, and I gave one that's from like a protest. I think the much more common ones are the ones that are occurring on video, where this sort of Q&A format, either in some interview show or just a scholar sort of doing it on his own. That is sort of what I consider a more informal or modern format. The more challenging ones were looking for fatwas. So the best clues that you could find with regard to fatwas that were being issued were on Twitter. They were the best clues. But the problem that came up with that is, and this is generally speaking, there are no news articles about a fatwa within the list, or there shouldn't be. We are not interested in the news article. We wanted to find the actual fatwa. So oftentimes you could find clues in news articles or clues on Twitter, but then I had to go dig and find those fatwas. And that's much more challenging. And that actually revealed something where for a lot of the institutions that are issuing these fatwas or the scholars that are issuing their fatwas, the kind of archiving, the cataloging of these fatwas did not seem to be of a high priority. Their dissemination was far more sort of a priority than their actual cataloging. And so, for instance, the Darul Ifta in the agency that issues fatwas in Egypt would issue the fatwas, but it would take ages and days and longer to see an update on their particular website, for instance. And so you'd have to really dig around, and occasionally you'll see within the collection that we're fortunate to come across some Twitter user who has put screenshots of a hard copy of the fatwa that then we are able to sort of extract and put into the collection. So this is sort of part of the process that we went through to come up with these fatwas. Here's just a quick type of rough breakdown percentage-wise of what we're finding. And you can see here there is sort of a significant amount of video fatwas, but clearly more written ones. There's sort of geographic variety there as well, and this map gives a bit of a better sense of that, of sort of where these fatwas are that we are ending up finding. Okay, so now I want to move into sort of what these fatwas actually contained. And the two things there that I am interested in are, one, sort of the common themes, and then two, the local variations that you end up finding. And again, these are my real preliminary findings. I've looked at, obviously, all of the fatwas and done close reading of many of them, but clearly not all of them for, unfortunately, want of time. Okay, so what are we finding here? Now here, there's some fascinating things that start coming up, and it's based along certain timelines. So initially, I would categorize the two types of things that you see in these statements or fatwas as either pertaining to what I'm roughly calling theology, although there could be a better word for that, or roughly pertaining to acts of worship. Now, with regard to theology, the interesting thing here is what I began to see within my findings was that you were having statements around Corona being issued from Muslim scholars as early as January. Not that many, or I couldn't find too many from that early, but even in January, early February, late February, but you're seeing these sort of statements and ideas coming forth. A lot of those, if not the majority of those statements, are pertaining to these issues of theology, right? Is the coronavirus, is COVID-19 a punishment from God, right? And initially, the question is really revolves around whether it's a punishment God's punishment upon China. And the questions that are being asked are, is God punishing China because of what's happening or what they are doing with Muslims in their country, and specifically in reference to sort of the Uyghur situation and tragedy there. Now, so that's initially a lot of Muslims are asking this question. And then generally as well, just the question coming up that, hey, is this, in fact, there's a scholar out of Lebanon, Yasser Auda, who talks about the fact that he was seeing people talking about the coronavirus as a Muslim army, right? As a version of a Muslim army fighting on behalf of Muslims who are being oppressed. And he rejects that. And mind you, the other scholars as well are totally rejecting and kind of flabbergasted that these types of arguments are being made, because their simple answer to that is the virus is not contained. And we have seen in previous cases that this virus eventually will reach us. And, you know, Iran begins to start seeing the coronavirus probably earlier than almost any other Muslim country. And I'll get into some of the meaning of what that, the sort of earliness and severity of the virus, what impact that has on the fatwas themselves. And then the second major theme that comes up with regard to theology, and this is one that remains the case even subsequently till now, is the idea of faith in God, tawakkul ala Allah, right? The idea that, look, you are going to be faced with these type of calamities, these type of problems in life, and you just need to have faith in God. And certain things that you decide to do may be indicators of your lack of faith in God. And that starts coming up early on, and you see it appear in the introduction of some of the earliest sort of substantive fatwas, formal fatwas coming out of the Muslim world as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a bit also. And those faith in God, the sort of prophetic hadith or statement or tradition that says that trust in God, but tie your camel, is something that you see appearing quite a bit. You know, so this sort of balance between take the necessary steps even as you trust in God. Now, the majority of fatwas are dominated by questions around these acts of worship. These are the main concerns that start coming up. And as you get into March, now you are out of January, out of February, the more abstract theological questions are sort of going away. Now people are being impacted, their populations are being impacted, things are starting to shut down within their societies, and they are starting to ask these questions around acts of worship. The first question that really comes up is the question around congregational prayer. Can we gather to pray in congregations, most importantly on Friday, the day of Muslim prayer? Friday, the largest congregations gather. What are the Islamic law rules around this? And that's where scholars begin to initially start inserting themselves. And associated with that are also sort of the less attended, but 5 times a day prayers that are happening in mosques or masajids around the world. To what extent should those be allowed to go ahead or not? The other thing is that in March, right around the time when this starts hitting many Muslim countries, when COVID is starting to come there, you also are approaching, creeping up on Ramadan. And now you're going to have this entire month that's coming up where not only are people gathering together socially, but more importantly, many people who ordinarily may not frequent the masjid are going to be doing that during Ramadan for the evening Taraweeh prayers, the congregational prayers that take place sort of in the evenings after sunset in mosques around the world. This becomes a huge question. And people start asking it very close to Ramadan as to what are we going to do there. And the tensions that are present here, which I'm going to conclude with in a little bit, are really tensions that you begin to see as to who has authority in this space. Is it religious scholars? Because this is certainly a matter of religion. Or is it public officials? Because certainly there is a dimension of public welfare that's present here because of COVID. What is that balance, and how do we sort of engage that? The sort of two or three other associated things, Ramadan, obviously then also gathering at Eid. So you see towards the end of Ramadan an increase in fatwas as they relate to Eid prayers and whether they can be done or not. And then there's sort of initial questions already, and they'll probably come up even later, around Hajj, the annual pilgrimage, and sort of the pilgrimages, the minor pilgrimages that are happening throughout the year. And Saudi Arabia sort of shut things down for a while, so that wasn't an issue that got discussed terribly at this point. And then the question of zakat, a lot of people give their alms, give their sort of annual charity, religious charitable tax. They give that during Ramadan because the idea is that it's meant to have more blessings during that period. That the question comes up whether you can give it beforehand because people have needs, and so that becomes addressed. And then the other major, so in addition to congregational prayers and maybe Ramadan as well, the other major issue that comes up is the issue of last rites, right? Because COVID presents, and especially early on, presented this real dilemma, which was, can we actually bury these people without getting infected ourselves? Is it possible? And the burial, the last rites within the Islamic faith and Islamic law, what it prescribes, include the sort of washing, the ghusl, the washing of the body by other people. It's shrouding in a white cloth, and then the actual burial and prayer over the body, right? Those are parts of the steps of the last rites. And so the question became, can we do these? And an even more severe question was, can we cremate these bodies? Cremation being something that ordinarily is completely forbidden within Islamic law. Could this be allowed? Because if the sort of handling of that body is going to transmit this virus, that presents a serious issue for society. Okay, so these are some of the main themes that come up. Now, what are the local variations? And I just want to touch on these a little bit because I'm mindful of time. And here, the local variations vary based on a number of different things. And here, this picture, there's a picture of a map with Iran, which really is one of the first places impacted. On the right, you have a picture of a fatwa that was issued in late February by a fiqh council of senior scholars, predominantly really a Sunni council of senior scholars in Iraq. And this was one of the earliest fatwas I found, formal type of fatwas on this issue. There likely maybe other ones out there as well, but this is what I had found so far. And then in the bottom left corner, this is a gathering of scholars from a variety of different schools of thought within Pakistan, and issuing a collective fatwa that they had written together with regard to how to engage in worship rites in Pakistan. And I'll get into some of those differences a bit. Now, these local variations depend on a number of things. The first is the timeline, right? They depend on when exactly the virus came to your country and the severity of that virus. Those two things seem to dominate where your particular sort of fatwas are in the sort of, where they are in their development, right? Is how early you got this, how much time you've had to think about these issues, and the severity of the virus. And you can actually see that fatwas from the same agencies and the same individuals begin to change and adapt as the severity increases through the month of March, for instance, right? And you're beginning to see that a bit more now as well, where certain countries that maybe had not taken the steps that were more strict are beginning to have to adjust as the severity of the virus, the deaths, and the cases increases. The second key difference you begin to find is the strength of government authority, right? Initially I wanted to put this as kind of authoritarian versus democracy, but that's kind of roughly there, but it's really the strength of government authority, right? To what extent does the government have sort of a pervasive power over every inch of society? And some of that depends a bit with regard to how big the country is, how large their population is, etc. But you see kind of a variety of approaches. When the strength of government authority is quite intense, you don't see much dissent of Islamic legal opinions on matters that the government body is issuing. You generally see sort of support of it. In other places where the strength of government authority, or the government may not even be Muslim, but you have a very large Muslim population, there's far more freedom and much more sort of diversity in the types of opinions that are coming out. The other issue, which is related to the strength of government authority, is what prior limitations on free movement exist. Right? If you're used to the government cracking down, or the government putting certain limitations and restrictions on how you move and get around society, then you're okay, or the fatwas aren't sort of too pressed about these issues. Where that's not the case, where you have existed really on these matters of religion with relative freedom to come and go to the mosque, etc., to sort of operate as though that is your domain and you have dominion over it, then there is a real tension that emerges now when the government begins, for public health reasons, to try to limit the nature of your movement, limit the sort of freedom in your movement. Then the other two things, the nature of religious discourse and religious authority, that's also sort of comes up from the standpoint of the extent to which that religious authority exists within the state in some way, or really exists outside of it, and how that discourse has traditionally taken place in the country. And then there's certain country-specific circumstances that give rise to how and influence how the fatwas happen. And I just want to point to two quick examples of that. One is in Iran. Iran had to deal with this major question of religious tourism, ziyarat, right? Iran is a major site of religious tourism. And Shia pilgrims primarily come from other parts of the world, from internally within Iran, to visit a variety of different sites for religious reasons. They had to deal with the issue of whether to shut down religious tourism or not. It was, in some respects, quite country specific, because maybe alongside Iraq, Iran really has the majority of that, or a larger share of that worldwide than many other countries. And so a lot of their initial fatwas are trying to address some of these questions. They're also dealing with incredible severity. They're the earliest, so their fatwas are on a very different trajectory than other places. In India, and to some extent Malaysia, one of the major events that ends up dictating a lot of initial fatwas, and continues to, because it gets, particularly in India, gets a lot of media attention, particularly even from right-wing groups opposed to Muslim presence, is the large annual gathering of the Tablighi Jamaat group that happens in India and happened in Malaysia. And this sense and rumors that spread that became a vector for the spread of the coronavirus. So that begins to influence, these specific country situations begin to influence how people are looking at, or how the types of fatwas people are putting out. Okay, let me finish off now with just some takeaways, which really, these are the things that actually have me interested in this project, because I think they're just fascinating components of what's happening right now. The first is the role of social media. The idea that fatwas are being tweeted out and that tweets are a major medium of fatwa issuing and transmission and dissemination is in many respects, I think, fascinating. And you're having it done not just by sort of modern scholars, you know, or Islamic intellectuals, you're having it done by traditional scholars who have their own Twitter pages that are run, and that this is, and they recognize this. And again, this goes back to my point that the formalism and structure of the fatwa is less important, or seems less important, than the ability to disseminate and get this religious information out to people. That has seems to me to have much more of a priority for these scholars. The second major thing is the relationship to the state. The nature of this relationship and the extent to which, in areas where religious scholars traditionally have authority without much oversight from the state, what happens, or how do these tensions emerge when the state, for public health reasons, now has to start regulating religious worship? And to what extent are scholars willing to concede authority there while also asserting themselves in this space? What you will find is a lot of boilerplate language within these fatwas, which will say, if, you know, authorities issue certain directives, you are obligated to follow them. But subsequent to that, you will end up having the religious scholar or body of scholars, and this is particularly with those that are independent of the state, issuing their own directives with regard to what should happen or how things should occur in society. And this is something which this came to a head in Pakistan, where people began to take to task the ulama council, the council of scholars, for saying the statement and then issuing these directives. And people ask, are you the government? Are you now functioning in the space of the government? And so this tension between sort of the relationship of religious authority and state authority in these moments of existential crisis, I think, is a fascinating arena. The last 2 points, expertise on the information highway. What I mean by this is there is this sort of associated issue that's often talked about Sheikh Google, right? That you can sort of Google any religious opinion you want, and Google will answer it to you by finding some scholar out there who is giving that issue. But I think a similar or associated problem is that many religious scholars are also on this information highway. And they are also gaining, quote unquote, expertise in areas that they are not traditionally practicing in or familiar with. So you can see in these fatwas where they are giving directives with regard to how people should be spaced out in masjids, how the cleaning should occur, a variety of other things which is being informed by expertise that they themselves actually do not have, but are getting from somewhere. And so this challenge of expertise, and to the extent to which the sort of on issues around worship and Islamic law, the extent to which external expertise, external to religious scholars, can inform the fatwa is a real sort of challenge that's there too. And finally, the idea of the court of public opinion. And here, this I think is something which is a modern, it existed in the pre-modern space as well, but in the modern space has exploded in a way where public opinion, the court of public opinion, can be and often is a driver, an influencer of the nature of the content of fatwas coming out. Because for many scholars, they are mindful of the extent to which they can push their sort of the people who look to them for guidance, and the areas in which they have to be careful where they might delegitimize themselves if they take positions that are looked upon disfavorably by the court of public opinion. So I want to leave it at that because I'm about 5 minutes over my time. I know I had 30 minutes, and I am happy to explore. I guess I'll move to the next. So Q&A, moderation of questions. This is sort of some guidance for that, and I'm happy to move to that portion of the program. Thanks for your indulgence.
Adnan, that was great. Thank you so much for this fascinating overview of the emerging landscape of COVID-19 fatwas. While those of you in the audience start thinking about your questions, I want to use the opportunity of a couple of points you raised just to plug some future sessions that we have in this series. You mentioned the Tablighi-Jamaat movement, and we actually have a dedicated session looking at how Tablighis have responded to COVID-19 that will be offered by Dr. Dietrich Rietz of the Free University of Berlin, the Center for Modern Oriental Studies in Berlin, who I believe is actually joining us for your session today. And of course, you emphasized on multiple points in the presentation kind of the important and growing relevance of various digital, online, and virtual forums around these issues. And we have at least 2 sessions in the series already dedicated to that question, one being offered by Andrea Stanton, Dr. Andrea Stanton of the University of Denver, on July 30th, and then Gary Bunt, whose work is sort of synonymous with the study of virtual Islam, will also be talking to the series in September. So I want to go ahead now and open the session up for Q&A. Again, you can raise your hand to ask your question live, or you can use the Q&A panel dashboard to kind of pose a question in writing. And I can already see one in each of them. So let's try the live one first. And I think, so the first question will come from, and apologies if I mispronounced your name, this is Besnik or Beshnik. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, so thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. My question pertains to the issue of authority in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, when we are perhaps witnessing something that we can perhaps call the medicalization of public moral authority. And while I'm particularly interested in the case of Saudi Arabia, which was kind of not mentioned that much in the course of this presentation, but I guess the question can be asked more in general. So would you say that more often than not, fatwas coming from prominent Muslim institutions, fatwa institutions on COVID-19, have been largely complementary to the decisions of medical experts rather than the result of legal thinking that has also consulted the views of medical experts? Also, have you seen fatwas questioning the legitimacy of prayers in mosques that maintain social distancing, basically pertaining to the gap between the worshippers? Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Those are both great questions. So I'll answer it this way. The first is, in those countries where you have, and this goes back to my idea of the strength of government authority. So in those countries where government authority is sort of historically, at least in recent history, particularly strong as it relates to religious matters. So I look at the Gulf countries in this way in particular. You will see they're sort of aligning the sort of fatwas rarely that are especially being issued by the government agencies. They rarely don't align with the opinions that are coming out from the medical authorities that the state has themselves. So public health authorities and religious authorities are much more likely to be aligned there. With regard to other countries, so Pakistan, India, I haven't looked deeply into Indonesia, but we have one fatwa from there, but a variety of other places. And Pakistan is, in some respects, one of the more fascinating places. You see that there isn't much reference, specific reference, to the guidelines or directives of public health experts. Now, they are giving medical guidance, right? They're telling you you can, and they're issuing fatwas saying it's permissible to wear a mask and say your prayers, that when you pray, you need to be this far apart, that they're very specific guidelines as to relating to public health concerns as to how prayers to be conducted. Where are they getting these from? My assumption would be that they either have doctors within their congregations or their constituency that they end up relying on, or they are doing their own research on this, or they're sort of relying on things that they're seeing from other countries, right? And you can see how this challenge plays out in a place like Pakistan, because there's actually an occasion, I didn't have a chance to talk about it, where one of the ministries, I believe it might have been the interior minister, but I'm not sure, I don't have it in front of me right now, but one of the ministers in Pakistan sent a formal request to Azhar in Egypt for a fatwa with regard to COVID-19, right? Pakistan, Azhar does not have that type of religious authority at all, one could argue, within the Pakistani landscape. So what was the government minister up to? Well, he needed some type of competing authority that would be a little more aligned with the types of recommendations that they wanted to make, because Egypt, arguably the government in Egypt has a little bit more of a control over Azhar than the Pakistani government has over its sort of vast number of ulama, even the ones that gather together in these councils. And so it was generally ignored by the religious authorities. No one cared about this Azhar fatwa from what I could find. But it was interesting that it occurred. Now, your last point with regard to challenges over the sort of distances within sort of, so what you're getting at, for those who don't know, is that usually when Muslims line up for prayer, they'll be feet to feet, shoulder to shoulder is usually what's, the guideline, right? Feet to feet, shoulder to shoulder. Well, in COVID-19, all these mosques that are opening up, generally speaking, you can see pictures from even Mecca, they're putting like 6 feet between them and the person nearby, according to medical guidelines. So there's a question as to whether these prayers would still be valid with that type of distance. And for the most part, I haven't yet come across that type of debate. And it might be out there. I haven't come across it yet. And part of that, I think, may simply be because for the places that were trying to keep the mosques open, they're dealing with the more extreme scenario of no prayer at all. And so the idea of whether this was permissible or not, they kind of gloss over, because they're really trying to keep these mosques open.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Adnan. So we've got 3 questions in written form in the Q&A dashboard, and another live question that I would like to take soon from Dietrich Rietz. But just in the interest of taking the questions in the order that they appeared, next question is one of the written ones from Ahmed that you can maybe see there. And he's asking whether the project is going to have a cross-historical dimension to kind of explore similarities and differences between the fatwa that we see in 2020 in comparison to fatwa issued in the past during other plagues and previous periods of infectious disease.
So to be honest, my hope, my initial goal with this was just to collect and then have this as kind of this resource for scholars to use however they wanted, and I hope that they use it. I plan to use it in certain ways. I don't work on pre-modern fatwas in times of plague or epidemic, but I know several really astute scholars working in this space. And so to the extent that they want to do this kind of cross-historical work, that would be great. I tend to find that in our field, that can be challenging. You know, pre-modernists or pre-modernists, modernists or modernists. I'm technically a pre-modern, trained as a pre-modern legal historian, but you know, as a legal scholar as well, I'm very fascinated with legal argumentation today. But so the short answer to that is, I hope people do it. I don't have any plans myself to do it currently.
Okay. Let's go now to a live question from Dietrich Rietz. Dietrich, it's good to see you here. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Hey.
Yes, the question is, do you think that one could possibly argue that we see a process of secularization of fatwa giving, secularization not in terms of non-religious, but in terms of worldly, in the dini, dunyavi paradigm? And would that not, on the other hand, also on the governance issue, link in with global processes of somehow searching for modes of self-governance of communities?
Yeah, I mean, so that's difficult, because I would want to probe you a bit more as to, you know, what precisely you would mean by the secularization, because it's not as though the types of discourse that scholars are having today didn't exist in prior times, right? So in terms of even the dini and dunyawi, the sort of distinction between religion and worldly matters, I mean, that's all even has always happened, right? In some respects. So I guess that would be, I would want a little clarification there, I think, before I could give you a better answer.
Well, you are mentioning kind of the new modes of interaction, the digital world, and you are also mentioning, and I saw that and looked in particular at Pakistan, how people or the scholars reacted to what they perceived as the need of their immediate community. So, and creating opinions or arguments which were actually diverse and contradictory from Islamic Sharia legal perspective, and rather more oriented towards what they perceived the community would expect of them.
Right. So this goes to this point of the court of public opinion, and that those kind of expectations from there. And I think that it's more pronounced today. But I actually don't, in my work in the pre-modern period, I don't think it's necessarily absent back then either. It's a little harder to tweak out and find. And this, I'm talking way back, you know, in sort of 11th, 12th century even, where they are responsive to the public. And Sherman Jackson out at USC has written a little bit about this in that context. In terms of the medium, it's interesting because I think that this process of adopting new mediums of transmission always it's also something that's not that has happened in the past and goes through a period of kind of challenge, and then, you know, people sort of accept it as widespread. So I give you an example of, there was a period where the loudspeaker at the mosque was a major issue, right? Was a major issue as to whether that was permissible with regard to whether the adhan could go out over it, whether, you know, it would count if you were listening from the loudspeaker and not the actual imam, that it was being and this was initially to the point where people would, you know, cut the wires of loudspeakers at mosques initially, and eventually sort of people got over that. Likewise with kind of radio or TV as means of disseminating that also. So I think this has always been present. I would say that it's in a hyper stage right now because of sort of the information highway.
Okay, Adnan, so here's the situation we've got. We've got 2 minutes remaining,
Okay.
and 4 very rich questions waiting in the question and answer dashboard. I think everyone in the group can see the questions. So in the interest of time, maybe I can just frame a couple of the kind of crux points of the questions, and then you can do a sort of omnibus round of responses to them. So one of the questions here from Mahan is asking whether we can see a distinction between, in the fatwas you've been looking at, kind of, traditionalist versus progressive fatwas. Do we see those differences in kind of broader conversations around reform reflecting themselves in the way that these fatwas seem to be emerging? And then a question about the question of dawah, right? Not just individual religious observance or questions about congregational prayer, but the idea that one of the obligations that Muslims have is to call others to the religion. And so how do we see kind of the discussion and debates about da'wah and the boundaries of what's permissible in the context of COVID playing out? Another talk about another question about so some of the socio-political responses to the fatwas that have been made, protests that broke out in places like Mashhad in Iran, where you had a particular kind of response once restrictions were put in place against visiting shrines. And then a question from Omar Sharif that's a kind of little methodological in nature. Can you please talk a little bit about the criterion you used to kind of pick the scholars that ended up appearing in this study, which I guess gets back to some of the questions you were raising in the beginning about how we define the boundaries of who counts as a scholar and some of those kinds of issues.
Okay, great. So I'll try to answer these as best I can. I know we're going to be going over a little bit, but I clearly want to be respectful of people's time. So the question with regard to kind of tradition versus progressive fatwas, and Mahan's question here around reform in Islamic thought. I think one of the first things that I would say is these moments of existential crisis, and I would argue that 2011 and sort of the fatwas that I explored around the Arab Spring indicate this as well, is that even the people who are traditional or the fatwas that are coming from traditional ulama, there's an assumption that they can't be dynamic. And I think that assumption is false. And you find that playing out here as well. It's not like, I think that oftentimes, and sorry to make a pre-modern reference here, but I think oftentimes people think that every traditional scholar is like Ibn Hazm, the literalist from Andalusia. And mind you, I love Ibn Hazm because even he was incredibly dynamic in many ways, but they think about them as like strict constructionists, the originalists, like literalists, and that's how they're going to operate. But you actually find them to be far more dynamic. And so even in these cases, the distance between scholars who might be considered a little bit more progressive versus those who are more traditional wasn't immense, right? And even the traditional scholars were not on the same page. The ones in Pakistan were on a very different page than the ones in sort of the UAE or even the ones in Morocco, right? So the geography and their particular dynamics played into that quite a bit. The most I think you could say is some of the progressive scholars were much more accommodating of things like saying your prayers online or doing Jummah online much earlier. And it took traditional scholars a bit to get to that point if they got there, right? So they're able to accommodate good innovation, if you will, much quicker in some respects than others. The question of dawah and this question of sort of, I think the related question that comes up for Matthew around, this being a wake-up call and death and heaven and hell, those themes are present throughout. They dominate very early on, before sort of practical considerations start coming in, before sort of the virus is in the midst of these Muslim countries. Those questions are dominating. They're still present, and they're particularly present in sermons even more than these fatwas. But they're there as sort of, hey, this is, and even I would say here, going to Mahan's question around progressive, even sort of, so Javed Ghamdi, a scholar who I study a little bit and is sometimes termed as sort of a traditionalist, progressive, or some label like that. I mean, even for him, he sort of frames this as a moment of tanbih, of sort of warning and reflection in some respects as to you know, the status, our status right now, our relationship with God, etc. So that theme is definitely present and there. In terms of ziyarat, Seema's question of ziyarat in Iran, from what I've found so far, there is definitely sort of a bit of a consensus that developed eventually around whether to stop it or not. Initially, there wasn't. And the government was really driving that as well, because part of Iran, the Iranian government's approach initially had been to try to downplay and to prevent sort of a panic from taking place. And if you shut down ziyarat in Iran, there will be panic because that's a major thing that's happening. And so even when it started happening, there were these protests. One of the interesting dynamics that comes up is in the Iraqi Fiqh Council's fatwa, which is a fiqh council that is of Sunni scholars that was really created as a sort of the notion of a marjia, you know, a sort of marjia taqlid, so a scholar who you refer to for religious guidance, right? That sort of formal position within the Shi'i community. The Sunnis created this ulama council. The interesting thing is, it's one of the only fatwas that I have found from Sunni scholars or otherwise that had a line, this is late February, saying all ziyarat should be forbidden, right? And so I don't want to characterize that as kind of a sectarian thing necessarily, but there was this interesting dynamic there where they were very mindful of this element within their society that has a large Shi'i population, and they made sure to include it within their fatwa as well. And then finally, the question about picking scholars. This was tough. And I won't say in any respect that I had some neat, clean formula. I think my formula, one, scholarly bodies that were affiliated with a government, so some agency, some Dar al-Ifta, etc., automatically got in. If you were a Dar al-Ifta, if you were a formal agency that issues fatwas, automatically in. If you were a collective body, if you were like the International Union of Muslim Jurists or something along those lines, I automatically brought you in, because my idea was that, one, you sort of have this formal authority, the other place you are developing sort of a collective authority of sorts because you have so many people involved. So those would get in. The real questions were about individual scholars, and there's so many that it becomes difficult as to who you include or not. Initially, my goal was to try to include at least things from people who are fairly well known, scholars who have international reputations that extend beyond their particular local context. And so I was looking for those type of folks. It extended beyond that then to just, you know, whatever I could initially find. And I tried to include as much as I could. I did have to, at certain points, make distinctions between people who I said might be scholars, others who may just be kind of televangelists of sorts. And I tried to keep the televangelists off for now as I collect the other folks. But again, I think there are fair critiques to be made about people who are included and people who are not included so far. The ones who are not included so far, I actually can refer you to a form where we actually are trying to crowdsource this now. And so there's a form that you can fill out which will allow you to submit your own fatwas to the project. And I offhand can tell you what it is really quickly.
If you want, Adnan, you can also throw the link into you can cut and paste it, you can throw it into the chat window.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just gonna throw that into the chat window now for those who might be interested. This is sort of the, let me just put it into the chat. Okay. So it's just go.rutgers.edu/COVID fatwa form. It's on my Twitter page as well. I'll be putting it up quite a bit, but I welcome all submissions. Again, I really, I hope to do some work out of this in terms of write something out of this, but I really want this to just be a resource for other scholars. And, I'd love sometime down the line to organize, something where we come and talk about this in a year or a year or two after we've done some work and seen what we can find. And yeah, so I just hope it's a resource.
Great. So Adnan, thank you so much for this presentation today and for kicking off this whole series. I think it's a great kind of sampler of the kind of richness with respect to the kinds of questions that we're going to be looking at over the course of the next couple of months. So we're a little bit over time, and that's fine. But again, it speaks to the richness of the topic. I wanted to offer just a few brief kind of closing, more kind of housekeeping reminders. First of all, and I see that Matthew already raised this in the chat room, a recording of Dr. Zulfiqar's remarks will be made available. And what I would urge you all to do is to sign up for the AVACGIS Center's mailing list. And if you scroll up in the chat room, you can see exactly where to do that. And if you do that, you'll get notification of when the video becomes available, and you'll also get full details of the future sessions in the series, which continue over the next few months, where we'll be inviting a number of scholars whose work is beginning to look at the intersection of COVID-19 and Muslim religiosity. Our next session will be on June 30th at 2 p.m., where anthropologist Dr. Donna Austin will be speaking on the pandemic of white supremacy, making Black Muslim lives matter in a COVID-19 world. And we'll be circulating full details of that session within the next couple of days. I also want to remind those of you who are graduate students that we're currently accepting applications for our 2020 book review colloquium on Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies that will be held on October 9th, 2020 in an online format. And you'll see a link to the relevant details for that also in the chat room. Thank you, Aisha, for putting that up. It just remains for me to thank Dr. Zulfiqar first and foremost for being with us this afternoon, and to thank all of you for joining us. And we hope very much to see you in the future sessions in this series, and hope everyone stays safe and stays well. Thanks very much.
Thank you all, and thanks everyone for attending. I appreciated all the questions as well, and I appreciated this opportunity. And just to plug, I think Donna is great and does fascinating work. So I hope everyone attends that.
We're starting with a Rutgers twofer.
Yeah, always a good way to start. So.
Great. Thanks again, everyone, and take care.
Thank you.